Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. We got up early again to do a little bit of fishing. The rumor is the bite's been pretty tough on the river because the water's real low. There's very little current. It's just kind of one of those things at the end of the summer. If we don't get any rain, we don't get any current. And if the water's low, what happens is a lot of the cover that's in the banks and in the river loses their fish holding ability. And that could be for a couple of different reasons. One, if the water drops, there just may not be enough water on that piece of cover for the fish to feel comfortable there. And two, a lot of times the only reason cover holds fish is because the fish are looking to pull out of heavier current, sit behind that object, whether it's so they don't have to be swimming all day, or because it more likely it's an ambush location so they can sit there and wait for the current to bring food to them. The thing is, if there's no current, the food does not come to them as quick as they'd like, so what ends up happening is the fish seem to disperse from a lot of that cover. Now, in my opinion, they do not move that far from the cover. A lot of times they just pull out from it, use that cover as a home base location, but if they're out looking for food, they might be 15, 20 feet in front of the cover. What that does is it makes it really difficult to fish when you have conditions like this, because generally speaking, you know, you're going to have more success when you know right where that fish is at. So if you know there's a stump and they're pulled up tight to the stump because it's got enough water on it or you've got enough current flow, you only need to fish the stump. If you have conditions like we have now and they're pulled away from the stump, you can't necessarily just say I'm going to soak a worm by that stump or flip a jig to it or bounce a crankbait off that stump. And because of that, it makes fishing more difficult. And it's one of those things where you have to choose your baits wisely. Like for me, I love to flip. And if I've got, high water, fast current, I'm going to be flipping if I can get away from that, regardless of largemouth or smallmouth or spotted bass. That's what I want to be doing. And when I say flipping, I may not actually be flipping a jig or a Texas rig. I may be flipping a swim jig. I may be flipping a spinnerbait. I could be flipping a chatterbait. I could be even short pitching a crankbait. So it's really just target isolated fishing. But when you have conditions like now, the fish are pulled away, this is when one of my favorite baits starts to shine. And that's when you talk about your balsa crankbaits. In this case, this is a Bagley Balsa B, one of my favorites. This is the 2-inch. I think they have a 2.5-inch as well, which is a little bigger. Now I'm fishing here on the Wisconsin River where I know a good percentage of my fish are going to be smallmouth, so I like to go with the 2-inch size because it really just fits in their mouth better. And I'm not looking for a bigger profile. We don't have gizzard shad, we don't have big shad in the river here. In fact, we've got like emerald shiners and small little shiners. So I like to throw a Balsa B, the 2-inch size. The other one that is working really well for me of late is the Rapala BX Brat, as I like to call it, otherwise known as the BX Brat. This is the 6 size. I call it the brat because we're in Wisconsin and it's spelled the same way as brat. And I think the fish would rather eat a bratwurst versus a brat. But this is the BX Brat by Rapala, which is an awesome great bait as well. So both of these are balsa baits. And the reason I like throwing balsa so much over, a traditional plastic in conditions like this is because I have so much wood, so much shallow rock that I want a high float bait. This Bagley Balsa B is one that is just a very high float. So if you've got a bait that floats very high, what that means is the more cover I bounce it off of, you're going to get a better backup and it's going to move away from that cover. And which, that's important for me because I'm not fishing just an isolated piece of cover. And in conditions like this, when you have no current and you've got just, a little bit of shallow water, well, one, balsa baits don't tend to generally run all that deep. If you find a 10-12 foot balsa running bait, that's pretty good. Most of the balsa baits are going to be your shallow running style baits, which I love for conditions like this because I'm not fishing deeper than really 4 or 5 foot of water. But really what happens is I want a bait that will rise quick in these conditions because that triggers the fish to bite. I'm not looking to bump into a piece of cover and let my bait kind of suspend by it and potentially slowly float up. I want a bait that's going to bump and come off of it quick. And the reason for that is that's the triggering motion. In conditions like this where there's nothing to hold the fish tight to the cover, you want a bait that's going to have its own fish triggering reaction. You know, that's what we're after, are those reaction strikes. So that's one reason I love the balsa. Another is because when I do have this much wood, I want to make sure that bait floats away from the wood. Plus, when I'm fishing it in current, and yes, we still have some current, but not much, I want a bait that will back up enough into the current to move away from that object where it's not actually gonna get stuck. Because if you have a slow rising bait with a little bit of current, the bait might slowly rise, but what happens is the current still pulls it into the cover. So I want a bait that's really going to move away from it. It's one reason, like, when on rivers like this, I almost always throw a balsa bait because I think they really outshine. And the balsa B by Bagley's great. The BX Brat is another really good one. From a color standpoint, I'm looking at kind of two sets of colors. One, I like the really bright, opaque, you know, whites and shad type colors. This one, as you can see, is a chartreuse and pearl with a little orange, a little brown back. It's a great color here on the river. So that's kind of one range where I'm going with my pearls, my sexy shads, my chartreuses, something really bright. The other color range that I like to go with is more of your dark colors. Like, this is a red crawfish color. This works really well on the river here, but I like to go with your dark reds, your browns, your blacks, your dark, like, green pumpkin colored baits. These are really good on rivers as well. And this isn't just for rivers. These are kind of the two color ranges I go. I don't generally throw that many translucent balsa baits, mainly because if you have a translucent balsa bait, all you're getting is the internal side of it, and you've got the balsa itself that is kind of showing through, which is not a bad thing. In fact, it almost leads to some of the prettiest looking baits when you can find it. A lot of custom balsa builders, or, you know, crankbait builders that use wood, will actually use, you know, leave some of the wood grain exposed, which looks beautiful. But at that point, you're pretty much just obtaining something somewhat similar to a pearl or a chartreuse, because once that wood has a clear coat on it, it's kind of still got that yellowish brownish look. And if I'm gonna have that, I would just rather go with a really bright pearl or chartreuse base, because honestly, that's going to be a better triggering color than a natural wood type color. So those are the reasons why I like to use these baits, guys. It's something that I think the balsa crankbaits have gotten completely pushed to the wayside, probably for a couple of reasons. You know, I don't know this for a fact. My expectation is that they're more expensive to build, because a bait like this, you gotta actually make the wood versus just blowing plastic into a mold. The other thing I want to point out too, with respect to these, you know, so they're falling by the wayside. They're very difficult to find. There's not that many companies, at least larger scale companies, that make balsa anymore. You've got, you know, Bagley's a great one. Rapala is still making them, and that most of their baits are balsas, so that's awesome. But I think the expense of making them is probably one reason why you don't see that many companies making them. So they're kind of fallen by the wayside. The other thing that I want to point out with them that I really like, most of them are going to be silent baits. Most of them are not going to have rattles. Now, you can insert rattles into it when they make it, which is all fine and dandy, but you still have a much duller thumb from the rattle, because the wood that's surrounding the rattle generally makes that bait a silent bait. So, like in this case, this is a silent one, and I like that in a lot of situations. Now, if I'm really trying to create a lot of noise, that's when maybe going with a plastic version is one that will help you make some additional noise and bring the bait to it. If the river was flooding here, if the river was real high, at that point I'd probably prefer to go with something, a plastic bait that creates a lot more noise, because I wouldn't necessarily be fishing in super heavy current, but because I've got that much more water that's off colored that I'm trying to draw the fish to. So it's something to keep in mind. But that's one thing I do like about them, that they generally are silent, or they have a very light rattle compared to some of the plastic baits that are just overwhelming noise. I don't want to, a lot of times I don't want to bring my crankbait in and have it sound like a lipless crankbait. But guys, if you haven't checked these out, you really should have. If you're a crankbait guy, you should have some of these balsa baits in your tackle box. This is one I've had for a while that's gotten a lot of wear and tear. Caught a lot of fish on it. it's just something that I love to do, and these are the conditions where a lot of people are complaining about fishing being so tough, and it's like, guys, pick up a balsa crankbait and just fan cast around those same pieces of wood that you'd be catching them out of in normal water conditions, and you will still catch those same fish. They're still there. That's my piece of advice for you. Hopefully you can take that out, use it. And it's not just a river thing. This works on lakes too. When you have low water in lakes, it's the same thing. They pull away from the cover, you still can catch them. Anyways, guys, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you watching. I'm gonna go catch a couple of fish. I've got a couple hours before the boys wake up. And yeah, thanks for watching. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, we'll have another video coming out tomorrow for you.